Auraria is where Denver began.
You can learn a lot about Colorado just by understanding the full history of Auraria.
The neighborhood had been hit particularly hard by the South Platte River flood of 1965, and so it pretty quickly became a target of urban renewal.
By 1973, Auraria had been condemned and plans were underway to create the three-institution campus that we see today. There's a great deal of historic importance going on in the Auraria campus.
It really tells the story of where Denver came from, how it began, and the way that the city has changed.
Denver begins with Auraria.
This program was made possible by the History Colorado State Historical Fund,
supporting projects throughout the state to preserve, protect, and interpret Colorado's architectural and archaeological treasures. History Colorado State Historical Fund. Create the future, honor the past.
with support from the Denver Public Library, History Colorado, and the Colorado Office of Film, Television, and Media, with additional support from these organizations and viewers like you. Thank you.
Wherever two rivers come together is going to be an interesting place to human beings, and that will be true for people from many different societies and cultures.
The confluence of Cherry Creek and the Platte River was a place where the Native American tribes would appear from time to time. It provided shade and water. It was a oasis of sorts.
This was sacred land for the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and the Ute. There was interaction with our Plains Indians and fur traders back in the 1810s. So it wasn't as if the white people came in just automatically with the gold rush. There was trade established around the confluence.
Interestingly enough, when the first white settlers arrived to this area, the local Native Americans told them not to settle by Cherry Creek because it floods all the time. They ignored them and they got flooded out in 1864.
Citizens from bands of the Cherokee Nation had discovered gold at this confluence, but the exact location remained secret within the tribe for a decade. Until a man in Georgia, William Green Russell, learned of the gold deposits through his marriage ties to the tribe. It was this nugget of information that would lead to the Colorado Gold Rush.
The Auraria campus, its present-day location on the northwest end of Auraria, closer to the Platte River and the confluence of Cherry Creek, is where the original Auraria town site was. And it was founded by the Russell Party from Georgia.
The name itself, Auraria, enshrines the meaning of gold, the drive of gold, the pursuit of gold.
It was formed to develop the property. Acreage was given to each of the members of the company, and they started building little houses and putting up small stores, cabins.
Almost immediately that year, there popped up about 150 buildings on the town site itself.
Our first major city industries or institutions started in Auraria. You had your banks, your trading posts, commerce, mercantile companies, bars, saloons, gun making, cast iron making, etc. Everything that would allow for a booming town and a very pioneering town. Of course, when people came in through, you had those that wanted to bring in culture, such as schools, religious institutions, libraries. You had our factories, we had the smokestacks, you had steeples, a lot of the religious institutions, and those were our landmarks. We had a very distinct community architecturally and geographically that defined what we see as Auraria.
In 1858, the Russell Party from Auraria settled on the south side of Cherry Creek, and later that year, the Lawrence Party from Kansas showed up on the north side of Cherry Creek and established a town site that would become known as Denver.
Denver and Auraria came into existence in a state that's not exactly collaboration and congenial teamhood. The relationship between Denver and Auraria is very classic. That doesn't make sense to have two towns under separate origins right across the river from each other. That does leave a pretty open contest for a while. Is one going to have the major centers of commerce and government, and the other is going to come in second class?
Who was going to establish the main trading centers? With the development of the railroad coming in 1870 with Denver, you started having distinct blocks supporting the travelers, banks, hotels, other buildings. Auraria would still maintain more of a smaller residential structures plus industries, factories, and ironworks. The rivalry between Auraria and Denver ended in April of 1860 at the Larmer Street Bridge, where Denver became the official capital city at that time.
Auraria became West Denver. And that's not to mean that the town turned into something entirely different. It's just the evolving relationship between the different parts of Denver. West Denver is a synonym for Auraria.
Auraria from its earliest days had a lot of different kinds of people living there, but probably what is most notable is that it was always the neighborhood for people who were sort of working and building Denver.
Auraria in many ways reflects a lot of the patterns in migration throughout the United States. It was a very fast evolving city and town, and it didn't allow for these many ethnic groups to isolate themselves and segregate themselves. In many ways was beautiful because it was an example of how people would mix together instantly. And that pattern continued until the 1920s and 30s.
That was really one of the things that was special about Auraria, is that it had that kind of diversity right from the beginning.
9th Street Park is a wonderful example of people from Ireland, England, Puerto Rico, Cuba. We had Jewish, Irish, Mexican, all within one block. They tolerated and supported each other through horrible times, economically and socially. You crossed Denver, you had some distinct segregation by private and public institutions.
9th Street Historic Park really represents what the neighborhood would have looked and felt like over 100 years ago. It's a set of 14 houses that historic Denver was able to convince the state of Colorado to save and to turn them into a useful part of the shared campus.
9th Street Park is a wonderful example of middle-class Victorian architecture, a variety of architectural styles, many of the homes hand-built. They're very different from each other, various types of Victorian styles, cottage, Queen Anne, Italianate. We have a variety of architectural roof lines. It's a wonderful place to teach architecture of that time period and the importance that the architecture had in keeping a unity and camaraderie with our community. The 9th Street and Auraria had architecture that supported the humanitarian and the cultural exchange of our people. At one time, Auraria had 8 religious institutions and 5 educational institutions in a half a radius of 2 blocks.
What is now the Little Emmanuel Art Gallery that's there on campus was actually a Jewish shul originally.
St. Elizabeth's Church was built principally for the early German immigrants who settled in that part of the neighborhood. But by the 20s, it was decided by the Hispanic community that they wanted a church in that neighborhood. And even the donors to the German Catholic Church put a hand to helping build the second immigrant church.
Constructed in 1926, St. Cajetan's is one of the most iconic buildings on campus today. But there was one other building that would come to define Auraria. Purchased by Carolina Gonzalez, 1020 9th Street would evolve from a home into the Casa Mayan, a major cultural center whose influence would extend far beyond the city limits, but not without challenge.
My grandparents were Ramon and Carolina Gonzalez. They were one of a million families escaping the Mexican Revolution of 1910. And they had a 20-year journey finding a place to call home. 1029th Street is one of the first houses purchased by a Hispanic family in 1933, which was at the height of the Great Depression. Various ethnic groups came in during the Great Depression. You got to remember, when they arrived here in Denver, they were greeted by the Ku Klux Klan.
1029th Street was the first permanent residence in the historic district and is the oldest residential building on the Auraria campus. Built in 1872 by Denver's first dentist, this Victorian-style clapboard home would one day be known as the Casa Mayan and would serve as a popular restaurant and gathering place for Aurarians and Denverites alike, bridging the cultural gap in a time of great division. Fortunately, the Casa Mayan's location could accommodate its growing popularity.
It was one of the largest lots available at the time, and it allowed for a tremendous amount of alterations, architectural alterations, additions, modifications, and remodeling that was based on the Mexican heritage. 3 families have lived in the Casa Mayan house since it was built in 1872, but our family lived here the longest. My grandparents reflected that Mexican saying, "Mi casa es su casa," my house is your house, and that was not just a phrase, that was taken very seriously. It was part of the generosity, hospitality of the Mexican people, and continued on throughout the Casa Mayan. That spirit. And my grandmother got up 4 o'clock in the morning, prepared the coal, separated the beans. They invented the corn grinder for 200 tortillas a day, molino. They were pioneers in the food business. They did not take any shortcuts. They also had a struggle through racism, food racism I call it. A lot of farmers did not know how to grow or have access to particular beans, corns, or chilies. So they had to work with some of the Japanese, some coming from their detention camps, to work with us.
The Casa Mayan was probably the Mexican restaurant that was best known in Denver. It wasn't the only one by far, but it was the best known.
Casa Mayan encouraged those that were not accepted in other communities or institutions. A lot of the artisans, for instance, or people with varied political beliefs, had a refuge here. Someone who said that this was the best of what America was and what it could be because of that tolerance and support. So what came was mutualista, a type of mutual aid society. But what made it so special was it just didn't support the immigrants of Mexico. It supported the immigrants from Ireland and England and Poland and Russia. One of the big surprises was, despite the racial segregation of Denver and around the world, my grandparents were given the distinction of having the President of the United States ask for having a presidential dinner at their home in fall of 1948. President Harry S. Truman came here. That's the great American dream, I suppose, ending up having the President of the United States come by here.
In the 1960s, it was a common trend all around the country to look at downtown areas and try to envision the future and how they would be redeveloped.
All over the country, neighborhoods are getting classified as blighted, devastated, in decline, and those neighborhoods are getting targeted for being removed, the people being relocated, the buildings taken out, and something that is supposed to be better put in there. There's some sensitivities that make phrasing like slum clearance seem too blunt and too simple a formulation. So the euphemism, slum clearance, but you call it urban renewal, you call it urban revitalization, it happens all over the United States in the 1950s and 1960s.
In 1965, a devastating flood, reminiscent of the Cherry Creek flood 101 years earlier, seeped through Auraria. The neighborhood's state of disrepair invited urban planners to target Auraria for redevelopment.
There were these visions and dreams and a radical idea to create a tri-institutional campus for the 3 colleges. Auraria was chosen in 1967 under the aspects of traffic, circulation, accessibility, infrastructure, utilities, which, by the way, is why the community loved it here.
And so downtown Denver, in the central part of the city, there were actually 16 square blocks raised as part of the Skyline Urban Renewal project in the late 1960s that created a lot of vacant land that eventually was built upon. Then on the west side of the creek, where Auraria is, the housing stock was older and the neighborhood had been hit particularly hard by the South Platte River flood of 1965. And so it pretty quickly became sort of a target of the urban renewal syndrome. The city and the state began looking at what else could happen with the land.
You have the Denver Urban Renewal Authority moving at quite a brisk pace towards a plan to redevelop Auraria and not being very forthcoming about that to Auraria residents. So an unsettling period of a year or more in which there's all kinds of plans being made to end the residential character of Auraria. Those plans are underway, but they're not reaching the people who will be affected.
A lot of the families received letters in the mail without having any understanding of these plans that go back to 1966. But with the election of November 1969, they were caught off guard.
The future of Auraria would be left to a vote. Plans were already underway to construct a higher education campus that would displace the residential neighborhood. But voters would need to approve a bond initiative for the project to proceed. Before the vote, Aurarians campaigned to save their community and believed that they had enough votes to stop the measure. But the Sunday before the election, Archbishop James Casey sent a letter to be read at the pulpit encouraging all Catholics to vote in favor of urban renewal. It's not clear why the Archbishop did this, but Aurarians still believe that it was this letter that sealed the fate of their community. On November 4th, 1969, the initiative passed.
Voters did approve a significant bond initiative to create the shared campus for the 3 higher education institutions that still occupy Auraria today. But that essentially condemned the neighborhood that existed there. And there were still hundreds of families living in Auraria, there were still businesses there was a number of churches there. And so it set up a pretty intense debate over what would happen to those places and to those people.
It was a community. It was a thriving community, actually. And the proposal that was put together by Dura to find a place for a university was really to relocate all of those people who were living on the 169 acres. And it was actually quite controversial because we had not had an urban renewal program that relocated that many people. Many of them were grandchildren of people who had settled there originally. And so you had the grandparents, the parents, the children, and then the little tykes.
More than 200 families were to be relocated. In response, several groups were formed to resist the relocation. The Auraria Residents Organization and the Auraria Businessmen Against Confiscation. Their fight eventually reached the Colorado Supreme Court in January of 1974. But the court ultimately ruled in favor of the Urban Renewal Authority, and all of Auraria was to be demolished.
Historic preservation enters the picture in the controversy.
The preservation of our park probably would not have happened without the business filing a lawsuit. None of the people of Dura wanted to save any of these structures, including St. Cajetan's, all scheduled for demolition. So what we have here is a last-minute miracle by a non-government group called Historic Denver.
Historic Denver is a private nonprofit organization founded in 1970, originally founded to save and restore the Molly Brown House Museum, but very quickly realized that there were going to be other places all around the city that should be preserved to tell our story as a community. Historic Denver is an advocate and a resource for owners of historic properties and for the buildings that represent all the cultural stories of the city that we call Denver.
Historic Denver found help from an unlikely source, a couple armed with a camera working to preserve an image of what Auraria was.
It was perfectly clear that that area was going to be bulldozed, and there was no expectation that anything would be saved except, for example, the Tivoli Brewery and St. Elizabeth Church. So the object was to get a representative image of that whole neighborhood, hotels, the churches that were going to be kept there, and the residential buildings. And no expectation at that point that a collection of photographs would have any impact on what happened in the Auraria district. The executive director and president of Historic Denver heard about our project and came to us and said, can you develop some kind of a plan to save part of Auraria? And as quickly as possible, because the bulldozers were coming, we came up with an identification of the best block that we might save. It was clear that trying to preserve a bunch of houses scattered all over the campus was not going to work in terms of the authorities' construction of the new campus. But that if we could find a small collection that was in one place that would be representative of the whole, that would be a feasible thing, A, to get done, and B, to sell to the Urban Renewal Authority.
What happened was this idea, this radical idea of, can we possibly save some of our architectural heritage? But they had to raise close to $1 million in a scope of a year, which is about $6 million today.
Because of the need to raise money and the short time frame that we had to get to the point of moving forward, it was decided to rehab one of the houses on 9th Street as a model of what could be done for the rest of the buildings that were designated to be along with it in what would be the 9th Street Historic Park. That went very well. We were then able to bring people in, bankers, lawyers, merchants, to show them what we had done in that short year and say, we can do the rest of it if you folks will simply chip in. At that point in the game, the deadline was extended so that the new historic park was ready as a contribution to Colorado's centennial.
It was 1976, August of 1976, when Historic Denver turned the keys back over essentially to the state of Colorado, and the homes opened as offices. It's interesting because today we talk a lot about, well, what was the return on investment and preservation for purely sort of economic reasons. But Historic Denver didn't get a return on investment. It was all a labor of love to restore the homes and then turn them back over to the state for use and to continue to maintain them to this day as offices and other campus uses. There was also a lot of sweat equity that went into restoring the houses, a lot of volunteer work. People painted woodwork, recreated ironwork, did all kinds of landscaping improvements. Of course, they turned the street itself into the Great Lawn, but wanted to preserve that sense of what it would have been like to have a street, so you still see the original stone curbs. They salvaged stone sidewalks from other parts of the neighborhood to reinstall on 9th Street to create the feeling of what it would have been like in the early 20th century. So it really was the beginning of a new trajectory for how the city would do preservation, but was quite an achievement.
America has a wonderful tradition of preservation. It tells a story, the good, the bad, the ugly, of how our country became what it is. We have establishment of preservation acts to recognize the contributions architecturally, but also of people, places, and events that reflect our culture, our American heritage. 9th Street Park is a wonderful example. It's a microcosm of that heritage. The ethnic groups, the architecture, the functions. It's part of America's values that has gone through ebbs and flows.
Auraria now is a thriving campus, Auraria Higher Education Center. And there's lots of people whose lives have been improved and opportunities expanded by that campus.
Auraria is unique and special because it really is where Denver began. And so if you can understand the stages of population changes, of architectural changes, you can learn a lot about Colorado just by understanding the full history of Auraria.
All you have to do is walk through the campus and across 9th Street Historic Park to know what their legacy is to this community. From the past to the future, it is still a part of our community's heritage.
9th Street has a rich and in some ways complicated legacy. It really is the first sort of large-scale preservation project of its kind. It followed Larimer Square that was also happening in the early 1970s. It was also an early adaptive reuse project because the homes were not going to be residential anymore and needed to find a use if they were going to survive. But that's also complex because tied up in that is the fact that folks had lived in those homes and had to be displaced in order to have the campus built at Auraria. I think there are lessons learned from Auraria and what happened there and how we might do it differently if we were embarking on another similar project today. But I think the real legacy is that it's still there, so we can still talk about these stories. We can still see and feel and touch this part of early Denver and understand both the great and important things that came out of it and the also painful and complex legacy that resulted from the construction of the campus. Once a place is gone, it's gone forever. But if you've preserved it, you can continue to uncover the layers. And so having that real place gives you that opportunity to keep telling the story and to keep mining the story. You have to have a real place that people pass by on a regular basis that's going to continue to make them think about what is the relationship between the past and the present? What responsibility do we have to our predecessors and to the people who will come after us to have a city that recognizes where it's been and uses that to inform where it's going? I know that those of us at Historic Denver are grateful for the advocacy that the Casa Mayan folks have done to keep that story alive and to remind us as a community how important it is to know what happened there both 150 years ago, 100 years ago, and 50 years ago.
You get a deeper sense of who we are in time and what our relationship is to the people who did lose in that transition, and what we owe to their memory and why we should be hearing their voices and paying attention.
I call it the miracle of 9th Street, because it was a miracle.